Hey everyone, my name is Luna, and today I want to introduce you to a Korean terminology called Nunchi through both an anthropological lens and my own lived experience. This talk will explore how Nunchi shaped my survival, culture, and ultimately the rewriting of who I was in the US military. It's told from the perspective of a Korean American female veteran. Let's get into it. So before we start, here's some table of content. I think I'm going to be talking about 12 different items, and let's begin. So let's start with the credibility check, right? Because I'm not just out here talking about random shit. I actually have information and I have degrees that support this. So let's go. So for myself, I hold a 4-year degree with a double major in linguistics and anthropology, which is the field that study human culture, communication, and social behavior. I also hold a master's degree in forensic linguistics, which focuses on the intersection of language and law, language, law, and power. So anthropology in particular teaches us to not only look at what people say, but at what they don't say. Not only at institutional levels, but at the invisible expectations that shape how those institutions function. So my credibility check with the military is that I served 6-year contract training in 2 different AFSCs, basically the career programs, and I have served overseas and went on a deployment. So I think this experience gives me another vantage point because not only from a scholar of culture and anthropological perspective, but I'm also someone who lived and worked within one of the rigorous institutions in the U.S. society. What is this nunchi I'm talking about? So from this perspective, I want to explore a deeply Korean concept called nunchi. And this is not a word, but a lens. Think of it as a lens for understanding power, identity, and survival. Because that's literally what I had to go through. So definition of nunchi can be often translated as social awareness or reading the room, but it is a very shallow translation going from Korean to English. In anthropological terms, Korea is a high context culture, meaning that communication relies heavily on silence, gestures, pauses, and shared expectations. So nunchi is the skill of decoding that that invisible context. It is a survival tool woven into family life. It is reinforced in schools, and it is very much expected at workplaces as well. To lack nunchi is to be socially illiterate. And that's why in Korea, if you don't have any nunchi, you will basically be viewed very negatively in the social culture. Yeah, so we'll end it there. And next, we're gonna here. I think I'm gonna tell you more about the generic terms, so it's not related to my experience, but more of a lecture on what the hell is the high context culture you're talking about, right? So here I'll be talking about the background so that you understand me as what it is to be a Korean American. So in anthropology, cultures are often described as high context or low context, and Korea is very, very much on the high context culture. Communications, they rely heavily on, once again, shared expectations, silence, pauses, gestures, and what goes on set. Whereas in America, it is contrasted with a very low context, meaning that expected to be explicit verbal and direct. People say what they mean. They sign contracts and they write things down. So imagine when someone that was raised with Nunchi enters a low context environment like the US, or even, more rigorous locations such as the military, that cultural intelligence can backfire. So why are you talking about something that backfired? Well, before I get into my experience, let me give you some basic ideas of how it's used, everyday examples. So I mentioned earlier about classroom. In school, students have to have Nunchi. So in Korea, the Korean students are expected to not hear teachers constantly tell them, quiet down, raise your hand before speaking. There's none of that. Instead, it is most likely a dead silence in the class, as the teachers, they don't really verbally say, those words that I just mentioned. So silence is a big key takeaway that you need to be aware of. I know that I think with the Western culture, with the US, sometimes silence can get very uncomfortable. But given my experience and being raised here in the United States with the background of Nunchi, for me, I understand silence depending on who it is and where I'm at. And going into a workplace environment. So in Korea, the workplace environment continues on after work, meaning that typically in Korea, a team will end their work for the night, and then they will all go out, eat dinner, and basically go get a drink. And culturally, if your boss's drink is like less than half full, you have to, without anyone saying, hey, can you fill up boss's glass, you have to take that into consideration and then fill the glass before anyone else says it, especially if you're like newly into this workplace. Like if you're like an intern, then whoever's the youngest or the lowest ranking in that workplace will take up on those kind of nunchi jobs. And that's how you basically gain respect from your supervisors in the workplace level of Korea. So at home, nunchi is also like continuously like part of everyday life. So at home, Korean parents typically will not really say, I'm disappointed, like the word I'm disappointed. There might be few that will say it. As always, there's always an exception. They might just sigh or avoid eye contact with the child. So children are expected to read those signals and adjust without words. There was an article I read where the nunchi is learned as early as 3 years old. So the moment you turn taller, you start to pick up on all these different types of nunchi. So academically then, what it is said, right? In the recent years, research of the concept of the word, the culture of nunchi has been published in English, which I'm kind of proud to say, hey, there's actual English research that's been published out there. However, just because it wasn't published in English does not mean nunchi wasn't studied before. It has been studied for many years in Korea. But for this context and for understanding what nunchi is, according to Scholar, we're going to look at 4 different articles. So the first one, the 2012, it's basically talking about using nunchi as a survival tool. So for me, the word survival always will forever resonate deeply within me. And in 2016, we have Cromer, and they describe it as an identity. And in 2019 research, it is talked about a vigilance and well-being. And lastly, the 2025, this is a damn recent article as early as August 4, 2025. And here it talks about basically nunchi is across it's validating Nunchi across culture, and it's a skill that has to be adapted across context. So not culture, but understand that through context as well. But here, with my experience, I was that was never valued. So what does that really say, right? My military reality was that my entirety of that 6 years that I was served, survival, once again, I said survival was the biggest thing for me. And that is exactly what it was. I had to survive in order to live and be here today. So survival mode. This is something that I mentioned multiple times to my supervisors, that I always told them, hey, I'm constantly in survival mode. So at that time, I didn't have the strength or basically the lifespan within me to tell them about all this that I'm going over today. But that is partially the reason why I have this lecture style storytelling video that I'm creating, because if people actually care, if your supervisor actually care, they will try to learn more about your cultures. That way, as a human being, you understand how people operate with each other. So from my earliest training school year, which I talked about previously on the last video regards to my experience at fucking DLI, my life has constantly been in a survival mode. And unfortunately, even today, even though I've been out of military for over a year now, I am unfortunately still in that survival mode. So if you want to learn more about my DLI terrible life experience, I'll post the link in the description below. So if you want to hear about some of the stories that I had to go through, you're welcome to watch it, I guess. But regardless, every day it was a test. It felt like a test, because I had to anticipate, I had to adjust, and I had to endure. So to sum it up, it was living on eggshells every single day when I was at work in uniform. And the majority of that contract, the 6-year contract, was it was a living hell. Yeah, do not recommend. But yes, every day was a test. I don't think it felt like a test. I think it was a test to see if I will survive to see the next day. That's how bad it was with my experiences with the 6-year contract. Going into PHQ and vigilance. As I mentioned, vigilance is something that is hyper aware within the high context cultures. So in Robertson's 2019 research, they say that Nunchi is tied to constant vigilance, and even the military's own mental health screening reflects this. And since it is the same testing that is taken as a civilian as well, you will come across it when you decide to seek mental health. So it's nothing negative, but it's something that I wish people can be a little bit more aware of in the medical field as well as in the military. So what is a PHQ, right? So first off, PHQ is a validated diagnostic tool based on the DSM-4, and it is basically it's like a measurement. It's a criteria for major depressive disorder, and it is used widely in both primary care and psychiatric settings. Yeah. So let me show you the actual form of the PHQ-9. So as you can see on this lovely form right here that I have, sorry, that way. If you go down to question 8, it asks the question, in the last 2 weeks, how often have you been bothered by any of the following problems? And it's cut off, but basically it's not at all, several day, most day, or every day. That's the rating scale you have. And question 8 asks, moving or speaking so slowly that other people could have noticed, or the opposite, being so fidgety or restless that you have been moving around a lot more than usual. So in medicine, that question about being fidgety or restless is meant to signal more so on the psychomotor agitations. It's a clear symptom of anxiety or depression as outlined in the DSM and measured by the PHQ-9. I am not a PhD holding medical professional. I am only licensed up to a EMT level. So basically that's what this PHQ is used for. Regardless, continuing on. But that restlessness that is mentioned, at least for me, it wasn't a clinical issue. It was a way of life. I was always on alert, always scanning, because I have to adjust myself to different needs of the people, and always reading signals. Once again, reading signals can also include the body language and the silence and the quiet stillness. Because that's what Nunchi basically trained me to do. And in one aspect, because of that, I was able to survive and be here once again today. So misdiagnosis. Here's where things turn cruel, because the Western mental health, behavioral health clinics, they do not understand the Eastern culture and Eastern way of life. They will apply the Western belief, Western culture, and apply that onto someone who is not. I don't know if that makes sense. I hope it does make sense. And I hope I can explain it so it makes sense. So for myself, I did what the military says that would look better, right? I seeked help voluntarily with the behavioral health, the mental health, because I admit I was fucking struggling. And with that, instead of, once again, the clinician or the psychiatrist, psychologist, instead of them trying to understand my survival mode through a cultural lens, I was labeled as adjustment disorder. It wasn't that I couldn't adjust. It wasn't just that I had to keep adjusting again and again to survive. It was the whiplash of it. Every supervisor had a different opinion. So when I'm talking about supervisor, basically I'm saying anybody who ranked higher than I was. They all had different expectations, and often they contradicted each other, or they will set their own expectations and they won't tell me that something X, Y, and Z changed to a ABC. So I'm working off of old info because I wasn't never privileged, and they all assume I already knew the change was made. I digress. But I was constantly being pulled in opposite directions. What satisfied one supervisor would disappoint another, and that was my endless back and forth. And it wasn't just exhausting, it was mentally breaking me down. And because, once again, I come from a high context culture background of social intelligence, I felt those contradictions even more sharply. I was reading the silences. I was following the subtle cues. I was obeying the orders of those appointed over me, just as I was trained to do. But the problem was, those orders and expectations kept freaking shifting. Once again, shifting in a way that they just all assume I knew when nobody informed me there's a change. Sure, I should have known, but at the same time, for example, I was deployed, I came back. I have no idea what the hell has happened while I was deployed. So, as I'm trying to, process back into the base, coming off of deployment, if this is where my Nunchi comes in, if they are a little bit aware of where I was coming from, and if there were changes, then grace. They should give me a little bit of grace and just let me know instead of hounding down at me. But at the end of the day, my Nunchi kept me hyper aware of what people wanted in that environment. It only made all the contradictions more crushing. And that wasn't disorder. Like, I'm sorry, but if you do understand both medicine, the Western medicine, and Eastern culture, it wasn't disorder. That was my culture translated into disorder. That was my survival rewritten as illness. That was my intelligence reframed as weakness. Going a little bit on the linguistic side of the house, I want to introduce what code switching is with intelligence. So in linguistics, there's sometimes or something called code switching, which is a shifting between languages or dialect depending on who you're talking to. So a lot of these phrases, or I guess words that come up across, right? For Korean, it's Konglish, Korean English. For Spanish, we have Spanglish with Spanish and English, right? So I am able to talk a sentence using both Korean and English with proper grammar rules, but still making sense at the end of the day. Code switching. So with that in mind, I lived that same process with the intelligence side, meaning I had to switch back and forth between cultural intelligence, adapting across cultures, and social intelligence, reading the people directly in front of me. And we now come to this. When Nunchi becomes liability. So in the 2016 research, it's said that the Nunchi is an identity. And that's exactly what I felt in the military. Because I was aware of my Nunchi, it's basically, Nunchi is same thing as air. I just breathe in, breathe out. Nunchi is exactly like that. And because I was so aware about my Nunchi, my direct supervisors and officers often said to me directly, and I quote, "Not everyone can perform at your level of expectation." I'll say it again. Not everyone can perform at your level of expectation. But here's the truth. Whenever they told me that phrase, that sentence to me, I will always and have had and will repeat over and over and over again that I never asked anyone to perform at my level. The only thing I ever did was answer honestly when someone asked me, how do you do your work? Because of my academic background, once again, linguistic anthropology, forensic linguistics, and because I carry Nunchi, I never demanded that anyone to match up to me or to be at my level. I only gave advice in the simplest term. If you do at least one thing better or different today than yesterday, than last week, or a month ago, that's improvement, and I'm proud of you. That was the only crime I committed. Like, if giving a positive affirmation was wrong, then yes, I 100% agree. That is my crime. But for that, I was executed socially. Not literally, but through judgment, condemnation, and the disgust my supervisors had on me. They turn perspectives into punishments. And oh yeah, I got in a lot of trouble for dumbest shit ever. So, from my peers to supervisors to the officers, I was condemned for showing who I was. My cultural instincts, my nunchi, my very identity were treated as unfit for service. And that wasn't just criticism. That was execution of my identity. So the cultural clash. If something is getting erased, what exactly happened, right? And here's where the anthropology helps explain it. So once again, Korea is a high context culture. The US, and especially the military, is low context. So in Korea, Nunchi is praised as empathy, subtly, respect. But in the military, that exact same thing I was praised for is considered as behaviors to be read as hesitation, silence, weakness. So, what anthropology calls cultural intelligence, the military calls it liability. That's a high liability. And just to tie it in, right, to the recent events, DEI Rollback of 2025. The military that I served once claimed to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI. But after I left, under the 2025 administration led by the Orange Elephant, DEI disappeared in both policy and practice. Programs were dismantled, content were scrubbed from public platforms, talking about the DoD platforms. Careers were derailed. The message was very clear. Survival now depended on uniformity, directness, and sameness. But anthropology teaches us the exact opposite. Survival of humankind depends on that very diversity, on that very difference, on recognizing that there are multiple ways to solve a problem. It might not be the best way, but it is one of the ways to solve a problem. And because when institutions allow for multiple perspectives, they create the conditions for advancement. If the institution allows for creativity and diversity to blossom, to grow, and enhance, then yeah, you're giving the condition, you're giving the environment for your freaking airmen to grow. So, progress doesn't come from sameness. It comes from recognizing that no single culture, no single system, no single way of thinking has all the freaking answers. So here's my closing message. The tragedy is that the military could not see me as a human being. Instead, they saw me as a number. A senior supervisor even told me this to my face: "You are replaceable." Awesome, thanks. But I was never replaceable. What they refused to see was not disorder, but intelligence, a cultural and social intelligence. It wasn't a weakness, but resilience that I had to do to survive. It was not a liability, but it was my identity. They called it as adjustment disorder, but that's survival. They saw instability when it was vigilance. They condemned me for code switching between cultures, between the social intelligence and culture intelligence. When in reality of all that, that was my innate skill, my way of staying alive in a damn fucking system that demanded contradiction after contradiction and getting punished at the end. And when an institution cannot see that, when they erase rather than recognize, it does not just fail that individual right here. It's a failure of the system. So the enterprise that you guys always talk to me about, it's a failed system. In the end, Nunchi was never my disorder. It was my intelligence. The disorder was the institution, that very enterprise that did its best to erase it, to erase me. And with that, thank you for listening to my lecture storytelling on what Nunchi was. And just for more credibility, here are the citation of the articles if anyone's interested to read up on. Thank you.